Hi, everyone. My name is Alexandra Hudson with Civic Renaissance, and I am here today with Karen Swallow Pryor. And I'm thrilled to have you here. Thank you for being here, Karen.
It's great to be with you.
So Karen has her PhD and is a research professor of English and Christianity and Culture at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. She is the author of Booked: Literature and the Soul of Me, and Fierce Convictions, The Extraordinary Life of Hannah More, Poet, Reformer, Abolitionist, and On Reading Well, Finding the Good Life Through Great Books, which I own. And also, she's the co-editor of Cultural Engagement, a crash course in contemporary issues, and has contributed to numerous other books. She is the host of the popular podcast Jane and Jesus and is a monthly column for Religious News Service. Her writings have appeared at Christianity Today, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, First Things, Vox, Relevant, Think Conservative, The Gospel Coalition, Books and Culture, and many other places. And I think you have another book in the works, the Evangelical Imagination. Is that correct? And what's the subtitle of that book, just so our listeners know?
Yeah, no, those tricky subtitles they're long. It's the Evangelical Imagination: How Metaphors, Images, and Stories Created a Culture in Crisis.
Excellent. And that's coming out August 10th, you said, with Braza?
August 8th of this year. Yes, we're in 2023. So we had
yes. But it's available for pre-order for people to
yes, it is. And for anybody out there who, authors, this, pre-orders help. So
yes, they do. They absolutely do. I'm in that phase as well. So everyone go get the book, everyone. So Karen, your work is at the intersection of creativity, literature, art, the imagination, culture, and yet you're a voice on public life and civility today and the church today. What do you see as the intersection of your passions, those things that you're known for, the things that you write about that you are a voice for, and church, civility, and public life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a lot. And I guess, I think of myself as someone who, my primary spiritual gift is prophecy. So I tend to see things actually in black and white, and tend to just need to have this need to proclaim truth. I see truth, I want to proclaim it. And that's very much at odds, I think, with what we think about when we think about art and imagination and literature, which tend to be sort of in the gray and sort of nuanced. And so I think each kind of balances me out. I think my natural tendency is maybe to see this sort of the world in more black and white terms, but a life immersed in literature and reading and loving art and beauty has kind of balanced that out. And so I feel like I can understand and see both sides. I can see people who are, strongly opinionated and really believe, that they must proclaim the truth at all costs. And I just love learning, listening, seeing the world through other eyes, and helping that to, for me to see the world in a different way. I think art and literature does that for us.
That's a great insight. I think like your self-awareness that you have this tendency, this default aspect of your nature to see the world and, these dichotomies, right? Black and white, good and evil, right versus wrong. And I think we all do, especially, and it's easy to see that we all do in these divided days where, we're essentialized, we're reduced. It's like everything in the world around us and people are, reduced to who they voted for, or, their political valence in some way. And that is enough to make, it's like everything in the news today is like a Rorschach test. You could take, I remember there was one time, a very tragic instance of the burning of Notre Dame. And yet I looked at coverage of it, and people on the political right made it a political thing. And people on the political left were, said, this is why we need more government funding for beautiful works of art, right? Like it's like something just it can't just be a tragedy and sad. It's like, no, everything has to be channeled, seen through the prism of our predispositions about the world and our politics specifically. And I love that you said you turn to the sublime, you turn to the beautiful, you turn to literature to help cultivate that nuance. So what are some works of art or novels or books that have done that for you specifically, helped you to kind of transcend that black and white era that and tendency in nature, but that era that we find ourselves in?
Mm. Wow, that's such a good question, and there are so many. But the first one that comes to my mind is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Austen is one of my favorites. And what's interesting about Austen, I think one of the things that resonates with me so much is Austen is, and people who just know the movies don't realize this. Austen is a satirist. So she writes these, these comedies of manners, these social satires. And satire actually depends on kind of a very sharp sense of right and wrong and black and white, right? Because the satire is a critique. But her satire is so gentle, and this is really what comes out more in the movies. Her satire is so gentle and so well-rounded. I mean, she's satirizing everyone. And even Elizabeth Bennet, who is clear, like everyone loves Elizabeth Bennet. Everyone, admires her, loves her, respects her. Her father does, all of those things. We're supposed to love Elizabeth Bennet, but Elizabeth Bennet is actually very much corrected by her author, her narrator. Elizabeth Bennet, as admirable as she is actually ends up being, very devastatingly wrong. And so a book like that just helps us to see all of these different angles. We see the mother's angle. We laugh at Mrs. Bennet. We sympathize with Mrs. Bennet. We think Mr. Bennet is really funny, but he's actually kind of a negligent father. If we're paying attention, he's really not as admirable as on the surface. So that novel alone is one that I think does what we just talked about, like just helps us to see the world through so many different perspectives, and to not just immediately trust the first one that seems right to us, to question it. So that's one. I don't know how long you want me to go on, but
I love it. I love it. It reminds me of this insight that Steven Pinker popularized about the rise of the advent of the printing press, but specifically the advent of the novel being this tool that cultivated widespread empathy in readers. Because all of a sudden we are confronted with breadth and dynamism of the human experience, and it gets us outside of our own head and our own limited experience, and allows us to see things from other people's perspectives, experience, like walking in the footsteps literally of, if you're a man, if you can see things from a woman's perspective or some different socioeconomic perspective, but just again that practice of getting outside of ourselves and into the footsteps, into the perspective of others, being this huge boon for our empathy muscles. And they are muscles, right? They're things that have to be cultivated and exercised and maintained. And so I really appreciate that. And how you said that Austen's a satirist. It reminds me of the role of humor and nuance, and we've kind of lost it. We're so serious in the world today. Do you think there's a role of like levity and joy? What's the role of like levity and joy? I've been really kind of I love that passage in the book of John. Like you've come so that we can have life and have it more abundantly. Like we're promised abundance, we're promised a good life and a joyful life. Christ's first miracle is turning water into wine so the party could go on, so the party can end prematurely. Do you think that we've lost sort of that vision of the good life and that sort of joy de vivre that is as a promise to us as Christians? But do we see that in our public life? Are we all too serious and joyless, humorless?
Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe we've lost the ability. I mean, finding joy is kind of like any other muscle that needs to be exercised. And it's as much as I love satire, there is, when we get steeped in it too much, we just want to mock, and we want to make ourselves feel better by looking down on someone else. I mean, satire is harsh and sharp, but there are other kinds of laughter that are more joyous and more, in community rather than division. And so we can actually become, habituated to kind of the sneering mockery that isn't to correct. And the purpose of satire is for moral correction. A lot of people forget that, and even just to have the goal of moral correction is itself optimistic, because we believe that we can be corrected and we can learn and improve. But I think that, that the example that you brought up before about all the, every event being politicized, digital media tends to do that. I mean, it just simply makes one point of view go viral, and then the opposite point of view goes viral, and so everyone just continues to get polarized and divided depending on which direction of the virus they're going in. And I think that kind of division and separation makes it easier and easier for us to mock, to sneer, to put down, to be divided rather than to be united, and find joy
Mm,
in, in one another, even
yeah.
in our differences. We should find joy in our differences.
Variety is the spice of life. And in fact, instead, it seems like too often people go around wanting the world to be like exactly like them. There's no fun. There's not an interesting conversation. It's not an interesting, anything.
Mhm.
Um, what are your habits of personal renewal and like how do you nurture your interior creative life? One of my favorite books that's almost always on my desk is called The Artist's Way, and it's a book of spiritual creativity. She's a Christian. She was raised Catholic, um, and the author of this book. And she, Julia Cameron, her name is, and her theory is like everyone's creative, and that's meaningful to me as a Christian because I believe that we are little creators. God created us in his image, and like him, we partake in his nature. We're closest to God when we create. And part of me having one foot in politics, public life, goes through this book. I've gone through it many times. It's called like a spiritual path to creative renewal. But she says that everyone is creative, and I thought, to what extent is all of the vitriol and maliciousness in our public life today like a symptom of just chronic creativity, stifled creativity, where people don't have healthy outlets to create beautiful things in the world as we are created to do, and instead all that energy, all that creative, that wonderment, that stuff, that thing that should be channeled toward creating beauty is being misdirected and is being, we're angry at ourselves, but that's being projected on others, and we want other people to fix themselves, fix the way they think, fix the way they act, instead of thinking, what are some more productive outlets of this energy, of these so I'm curious. I've had that thought like of creative frustration being one root. Like we don't have enough opportunity to just nurture our interior lives ourselves. My final chapter of my book is about like how we've misplaced our meaning in politics, and we need things to fill us up, like friendship, like intellectual curiosity, like beauty and the sublime. Like I love this concept of forest bathing. It's a Japanese concept where you just walk in nature and like let the beauty of creation just fill your spirit. And of course, in the Shinto culture in Japan, that takes on a different meaning, but we can take that idea as Christians. Like God created nature and he created it beautiful and good for us to enjoy and for us to steward. So I'm wondering, what are some practices, personal practices, like you have an enormous creative output and you have enormous demands on your time. How do you do it all? And how do you fill the well spiritually, emotionally, creatively, so you can keep giving in all the ways that you do?
Mhm. I would say I wish I had like a magical formula, or I wish I were disciplined enough to know what I should do and to do it all the time. And I'm still figuring that out. But I would say the main thing that I do, and anyone who follows me on social media knows this, is I do run, several days a week.
Mm.
I am not fast and I'm not competitive and I'm not athletic by any means. I mean, maybe I was a little bit more in my younger days, but I really do the running. I go to be outside so that I can see the sky and the trees, and the fields. I stop and take pictures. So I'm very slow. I could probably walk faster than I run, but it's just being outside that and seeing the beauty around me. I run a similar route pretty much every day, and every picture that I take every day is like it looks like a different place because every day
Mm.
looks different, even in the same spot. And so, and I know, if I'm in the midst of writing something, working on something, um, I know that just getting out there and actually there has been research done on this. There's a great article in the Atlantic a few years ago about this, but that running specifically helps
Mm.
writers because there's a kind of mindless repetitive action to running. It doesn't require us to really think much. We're not like trying to get a ball in a hoop or something. And it's that repetition, that cyclical motion that helps our brain to process what we're trying to figure out in our heads, to put on paper. And so it always just helps me. I will stop. I've learned, because I often think of things when I'm running, and I know by the time I get home I'll have forgotten them. So I'll even just stop and type it out on my notes app to make sure I don't forget. So that's one thing. And I've also learned to adjust to follow my body's own sort of natural rhythms. Like I used to be a morning person, and I had to go to bed early. But the more that my life has been immersed in writing, it's not even been a choice. It's just that my brain starts working more at, in the afternoon or night. And so I follow that. So I get all my emailing and my meetings done in the morning, all the busy stuff. And then when everything's cleared, that's when I really start feeling the energy to write. And if I can stay up late and write, and that goes against everything that I used to be, but it's just a natural development in this process. And so I just kind of listen to my body and my mind and try to follow its own rhythms.
I love that. One of my favorite things that I do to foster projects that I'm working on is to take my eyes off the projects momentarily. And I really like listening to like lectures. Like I'm not a big podcast person. I feel like the podcast, it's too risky that people just go on about things I'm not interested in. But with like lectures, it's like just distilled info straight to my spirit. And it's incredible how many times like, listening to a lecture or something on something totally different than what I'm working on, just like sparks an insight and like makes you see a connection between two totally foreign subject matters or thinkers, and you just see that it just makes me appreciate the interconnectivity of knowledge and like all truth being God's truth and in new ways. But that's something that it brings me an enormous joy. It can snap me out of, if I'm frustrated at something else in life or losing patience with my children or something, it can just divert my energy and attention to something beautiful and better and elevate my spirit. So I'd like to know, Karen, how does your faith inform your view of public life? And as we were talking offline, it's not just people running for office that are in public life. It's thought leaders like you. And so how does your faith inform your work? And then I'd love to hear any advice you have for listeners for things that they can do to be more actionable and efficacious, perhaps, if they're people of faith, if they're Christians, and they want to have more of a role in public life. They want to cultivate their imagination, their creative output even, and have that be a tool of making the world better as it is yours, and as I think it's as my calling as well. What would you do? What would you recommend?
Yeah, well, we all have different callings in life and different roles and different giftings. And I think we really have to pay attention to those. We have to really understand who God made us to be and the positions that he's put us in, and lean into those. And so again, I mentioned earlier that I feel like, I've loved taking the test. I know my strongest gift is prophecy. So I have these opinions, and I have, I really do tend to see things in black and white. And so I've used social media. I mean, I have a social media presence. I have for many years. And so I do use that to kind of call things out and proclaim them. I know some of us in the church get criticized because we always, criticize our own people more than the outside world. But I think that's I want to clean my own house before I worry about everyone else. And so I've definitely used social media for that. But I actually, so I'm just saying that fits, using social media in that way fits my particular spiritual gifting and even my calling and my place in life. And so I think what can happen is that people see a person doing one thing and they think that's what they have to do, and that's just simply not the case. And so I think we just need to figure out how we can steward our gifts and our place in life, and not try to copy other people. I mean, we can see models and examples and try things out, but we don't have to be like other people. And that's something that I've never really struggled with for whatever reason, but I just want to say that. And Yeah, I think that I mean, I used to be much more interested in politics than I am now.
Mm, yeah,
I think a lot of us can relate to that.
yeah.
And I still think, politics is important, but we're in a time now. Well, let me back up a little bit. My main area of expertise in literature is the 18th century, which is the neoclassical period. That's the period when the novel developed and the idea of the modern self developed. And one of the things that neoclassicism is characterized by is, an impetus towards virtue, and virtue is the moderation between extremes. And so I'm very, very grounded and schooled in that era of thinking. It was a time of great extremes and divisions in the 18th century. And so those who were prophets and poets and priests were calling for moderation, for virtue. And I think we are living in a time we're so defined, as we've already said, by excesses and divisions and polarizations, that I think our calling as Christians, as people of the church, as peacemakers, as reconcilers, I mean, we are called to a ministry of reconciliation, is to understand the times, and the times being as polarized as they are means we are called to minimize the polarization. And I wouldn't have said that 10 or 20 years ago. I mean, 10 or 20 years ago, I would have been much more like the one polarizing, calling attention to. But we have so much of that that is having the opposite effect that we might want it to, if
Mhm.
that makes sense. So our times are ones where there's a greater need, I would argue, for moderation, for voices of reason, for listening, for empathy, for understanding, and for modeling those things wherever we can. Um, and that's the calling for this time. And so we need to be attentive to that. And so, maybe in another 10 years, it'll be, something else will be the need, but we have to know the times and moderate against the particular excess of our times.
Hmm. That's beautiful. It reminds me, Karen, of the end of Candide, Voltaire's Candide, this little novella about the problem of evil in the world. Like, why is there suffering? Why does evil exist? And the ending of that book, cultivate your garden.
Cultivate our gardens. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. You can't change the world, but you can change yourself. And what would it look like if we're Christians kind of reclaim that power we each have to influence our sphere of influence? We think it's small. We're not debating on MSNBC and Fox News in the halls of Congress. We think so we don't matter, but we do matter. Like everyday decisions, big and small, literally. So seeds of trust and goodness and beauty in the world that pay dividends that we may never see. But that's what we're called to do. We're called to make the world better, more beautiful in ways big and small. The metaphor of the garden, of civilization as a garden, is actually the frontispiece of my book. Yes, I got a frontispiece. I convinced them to. They've never done a frontispiece in modern trade book, but and how. Are little tiny acts of decency, of civility, the word I use for my book, of respecting, of courtesy, of graciousness, of hospitality. We may think those are small and insignificant, but those nourish the seeds that grow into a beautiful, flourishing garden of civilization. And relatedly, like our snide comments online, our thoughtlessness to our Uber driver, those sow and nurture seeds of a thistle bed, right? Weeds that corrode, that dominate, that oppress, that choke out life, not just in yourself, but in those around you. We are so interconnected. But so, to cultivate your imagination, everyone, read more generally, but also read Karen's books. I'm enjoying her book called On Reading Well, and pre-order her book on the evangelical imagination. We're excited for it to come out. And any final thoughts on the topic of the civility, public life, and faith, Karen, before we sign off?
I guess I just one thought, to extend the metaphor of cultivating your garden a little bit more. No, we have to know what kind of soil we're planting in, right? I mean, and that goes back to knowing the times. Like sometimes we have fertile soil, sometimes we have rocky soil, sometimes we have we're a climate that's of high elevation or low elevation. So we are called to cultivate our gardens, and doing that well means knowing, where our garden is.
Mm-hmm. That's
And
good.
reading can help us do that.
Yes, cultivate our imagination and creativity. I love it. Thank you so much, Karen, for being part of this important dialogue and for your voice, for your leadership in this space as well. And yeah, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.